The signature took less than 4 seconds. But Josephine Hartwell would spend the rest of her life remembering the particular weight of that pen in her hand. How it dragged across the paper like it didn't want to let go either. Across the table sat Bennett Crow, a man the whole county called cold, though nobody could ever explain exactly why, only that he didn't smile and didn't owe anybody anything and didn't seem to need a single living soul. He watched her sign with the same expression he wore for everything, like he'd already counted every outcome and found this one acceptable, nothing more. Her father couldn't meet her eyes. Her mother stood by the stove, with her hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she could hold her own heart in by force. Josephine was 23. 3 days ago she hadn't known Bennett Crow's name. Now she was promising to be his wife. If this story has already found its way into your heart, stay with it until the end, and tell us in the comments what town you're listening from tonight. I always like to picture where you all are. The trouble had started the way trouble usually started in Briar Hollow, quietly, then all at once. Josephine's father, Aaron Hartwell, had borrowed against the family's small spread 2 winters back, when the drought took half their cattle, and the bank in town wasn't in a forgiving mood. He'd meant to pay it back come spring. Spring had come and gone 3 times since then, and the debt had only grown teeth. It was a Tuesday morning when Bennett Crow rode up to the Hartwell place, dismounted without being asked to, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand, like a man come to deliver bad news at a funeral. Josephine watched from the kitchen window as her father walked out to meet him, the 2 men talking low for a long time, her father's shoulders sinking lower with every passing minute. She didn't learn what was said until that evening, when her father called her into the front room and asked her to sit. "Whatever it is," she told him, "I'd rather hear it standing." He told her anyway, sitting himself, turning his hat over and over in his hands like he could wring an easier version of the truth out of the felt. Bennett Crow held the note on their land now. He'd bought it from the bank outright, nobody quite knew why, since the man had more cattle and more acreage than half the county combined, and no apparent need for more debt to collect. He wasn't asking for the money, he was asking for a wife. He wants a wife to run his house, her father said, keep his books, manage his hands' wages, see to the cooking, the mending. He says he hasn't the patience for courting and doesn't intend to start now. In exchange, he'll forgive the note in full. Every dollar. Josephine stood very still. "And if I say no?" her father's silence answered for him. The bank would still have its due, one way or another, and Bennett Crow held the paper that decided how that played out. She thought of her mother's hands, swollen with the rheumatism that came every winter now. She thought of the barn roof that leaked over the south stall, the one they hadn't had money to fix in 2 years. She thought of her younger brother, barely 16, who'd have to leave school and hire himself out to neighboring ranches if the family lost what little land they had left. "I'll do it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. She met Bennett Crow properly 2 days later, in the front room of his ranch house, a long, low building back from the road with more silence around it than seemed natural for a place that employed 11 hands. He didn't make small talk. He laid out terms like a man reading a list of supplies. She would have her own room until she wished otherwise, full authority over the household budget, and his word that no hand of his would ever be raised to her, in anger or otherwise. "You don't owe me affection," he said, "only the running of this house. I expect competence. I don't expect warmth." "That's a relief," Josephine said before she could stop herself, "since you don't look like you've got much warmth to spare." Something almost like amusement crossed his face and disappeared so fast. She nearly convinced herself she'd imagined it. They married the following Sunday in the front room of the county clerk's office, with her parents as witnesses and Bennett's foreman, a weathered man named Amos Crane, standing in as the second. There was no church, no gathered well-wishers, no flowers. Josephine wore her best dress, the blue one with the high collar, and Bennett wore the same dark coat he seemed to wear for everything. When the clerk pronounced them married, Bennett shook her hand instead of kissing her, which struck Josephine as both absurd and, in its own strange way, considerate. He hadn't presumed. The ride out to his ranch took the better part of an hour, and they spent most of it in silence, the wagon creaking under them, the prairie stretching gold and endless on either side. Josephine kept her hands folded in her lap and tried not to think too hard about the fact that she was now Mrs. Bennett Crow, that her name had changed before she'd had time to understand what was happening to her life. "You'll have questions," Bennett said eventually, not looking at her. "Ask them now. I'd rather answer once than have you working around me out of fear." She turned to look at him properly, for the first time since the courthouse. "Why me? You could have married any number of women in this county who'd have come willing and saved yourself the trouble of buying a wife outright." "I don't have patience for courting," he said again, the same line he'd given her father. "And willing women in this county want things I'm not prepared to give. Conversation, affection, a husband who comes home and talks about his day." He paused. "Your father told me you're sensible. I needed sensible. That's a strange compliment." "I don't give compliments, I give descriptions." He flicked the reins. "You'll find I mean most things plainly, Mrs. Crow. It'll save us both trouble if you take me at my word, Mrs. Crow." She turned the name over in her mind the rest of the ride, trying to decide if it fit. The first weeks were an education in the particular loneliness of Bennett Crow's house. He rose before dawn and was gone to the herds before she woke, and he came back well after dark, ate what she'd prepared with brief, genuine thanks, and retired to his study with a ledger most nights, rather than sitting with her by the fire. She ran his household with the same care she'd run her parents, and if anyone had asked her in those first weeks whether she thought she'd come to love this silent, unreachable man, she'd have laughed in their face. But Josephine had grown up watching people, the way you learn to watch when you've spent your whole life needing to read a room before you can afford to speak in it, and she began to notice things. She noticed that Bennett paid his hands a full week's wage, even during the slow season, when other ranchers in the county cut pay without a second thought. She noticed that when old Amos Crane's knee gave out on him in October, Bennett quietly moved him to lighter work without ever once mentioning it, sparing the man the indignity of being told he couldn't do what he used to. She noticed that when she mentioned, only once and only in passing, that her mother's hands ached in the cold, a jar of liniment showed up on the Hartwell porch within the week, with no note and no acknowledgement that Bennett had anything to do with it, though she knew he had. He didn't speak of these things. He simply did them and moved on, as if kindness were a chore like any other, something to be handled efficiently and without fuss. The town, however, was less kind. Briar Hollow had its opinions about the marriage, and most of them were not flattering to either party. Word traveled fast that the Hartwell girl had been all but sold to settle her father's debts, and there were women at the general store who looked at Josephine with open pity, and men who looked at Bennett with something closer to suspicion, as though buying a wife outright confirmed every dark rumor they'd ever whispered about him. "You don't have to listen to them," Bennett told her once, the one time she came home from town visibly rattled by the whispering. "Their opinion of me has never once put food on my table or paid a hand's wage. I find I can live without it. It's not your reputation I'm worried about being dragged through the mud," Josephine said. "It's mine." He was quiet a long moment. "Then I'll go to town with you from now on, if that helps. Let them see we present a united front, whatever they think is happening behind closed doors." It was such a small offer, practical and unromantic on its face, but Josephine understood it for what it was, an offer of protection, made without a single word of affection attached to it, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd dressed it up in pretty language. He kept his word. After that, he rode into town with her every Saturday, stood beside her at the counter while she did the household shopping, and said little. But his presence alone seemed to quiet most of the talk. Whatever else people thought of Bennett Crow, no one in Briar Hollow was foolish enough to cross him to his face. It was around the second month that Josephine began to understand something had shifted in herself, though she couldn't yet have named when it happened. She found herself listening for the sound of his horse coming up the drive in the evenings. She found herself setting aside the parts of supper she knew he liked best, the way she did instinctively for people she cared about, before she'd consciously decided she cared about him at all. She found herself, one night at the table, telling him about her day, the hen that had gotten loose, the letter from her brother, the way the light had hit the wheat field that afternoon, and made her think of something she couldn't quite put into words, and looking up to find him watching her with an attention she hadn't earned through any task or competence, just through being there, talking, alive in front of him. "You're staring," she said. "I'm listening," he corrected, though he didn't look away. "There's a difference." It was a small moment, nothing at all really, but Josephine carried it with her for days, turning it over the way she'd once turned over the strangeness of her own married name. The real trouble arrived in November, in the shape of a man named Foley, a lawyer out of the county seat, who came to the ranch one gray afternoon with papers under his arm and an expression of practiced sympathy that Josephine distrusted on sight. It turned out that the original note on the Hartwell land, the one Bennett had supposedly settled in full, had been improperly transferred. A clerical oversight, Foley called it, though something in the careful way he avoided Bennett's eyes suggested it was less an oversight and more a deliberate maneuver by men in town who'd never liked Bennett Crow owning the largest spread in the county and saw an opportunity to take a piece of it back. If the transfer couldn't be corrected within 60 days, the debt would revert to the bank in full, plus 2 years of accrued interest, an amount that would ruin the Hartwells twice over, this time with no Bennett Crow standing between them and the bank. Josephine watched her husband read through the papers at the kitchen table, his face giving away nothing, the same stillness he'd worn the day he'd come to buy her hand. When Foley left, she expected anger. Instead, Bennett simply set the papers down, folded his hands, and said, "I'll ride to the county seat in the morning." "They did this on purpose," Josephine said, "because they don't like you having so much land, because of what people already think about how we married." "Likely," Bennett agreed. "Aren't you angry?" "I find anger costs more than it's worth most days." He looked up at her then, and something in his face was different from the careful blankness she'd grown used to. Something rawer, harder to read. "I am, however, concerned. This affects your family, not only mine. I told your father I'd settle the debt. I intend to keep that word, whatever it costs me to do it." "It isn't only about the debt anymore," Josephine said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I'm not afraid of being poor again, Bennett. I grew up poor. I know how to be poor. I'm afraid of what happens to you, fighting men with more lawyers and more friends in the capital than you have." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual flat precision. "I haven't had anyone afraid for my sake in a long while, Josephine. I find I don't quite know what to do with it." It was the first time he'd ever used her given name without the Mrs. attached to it, and she felt the word land somewhere underneath her ribs, warm and unfamiliar. The next 6 weeks tested both of them in ways neither had expected when they'd signed their names in the county clerk's office. Bennett rode to the county seat 3 times, sat through hearings that dragged for hours, and came home each time grayer with exhaustion, but never once raising his voice about it, never once making Josephine feel like a burden for the debt that had started this whole arrangement. She did what she could, which turned out to be more than either of them had guessed. She'd kept careful books since the day she'd married him, and when it came time to prove the legitimacy of the original payment, it was her records, dated, detailed, meticulous in a way Bennett's own ledgers weren't, that gave the lawyer something solid to stand on. She testified, when it came to it, sitting straight-backed in front of a county judge, and answering every question without flinching, describing the day Bennett had ridden to her father's house, the terms he'd offered, the payment he'd made. "And do you love your husband, Mrs. Crow?" the opposing counsel asked her at one point, clearly hoping to rattle her, to paint the marriage as nothing but a cold transaction unworthy of the court's sympathy. Josephine looked across the room to where Bennett sat, his hat in his hands the same way her father's had been the day this all started, watching her now with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something almost like fear, like he genuinely didn't know what she would say. "I didn't when I married him," she said. "I do now. I don't expect that to mean anything to this court, but it's the truth, and I'd rather give the truth than something easier to hear." The courtroom was quiet a moment. Bennett's hands had gone still on his hat. The judge ruled in their favor 3 days later. The transfer was corrected, the bank's claim dismissed, and the men in town who'd hoped to see Bennett Crow brought low went back to their business, with nothing to show for the trouble they'd caused, except a county-wide reputation for having tried and failed. They rode home together that evening, the same hour-long stretch of road they'd traveled the day they married, the prairie gold and endless on either side, just as it had been then, though nothing else about the ride felt the same. "You didn't have to say that," Bennett said eventually. In the courtroom. "About loving me." "I know," Josephine said. "I said it because it was true. He pulled the wagon to a stop, right there in the middle of the empty road, and turned to look at her properly. "I never expected this," he admitted. "Any of it. I bought myself a wife to keep my house in order, Josephine. I never once let myself imagine I'd get a partner, someone who'd fight for me the way you did in there. You never asked for it," she said. "You only ever asked for competence. I gave you that, and somewhere along the way I gave you the rest too without either of us deciding it on purpose. Do you regret it? Any of it? The way it started?" She thought about the morning her father had called her into the front room, the weight of that pen in her hand, the 4 seconds it had taken to sign away the life she'd thought she was going to have. "I regret that it had to start the way it did," she said honestly. "I don't regret where it's brought us." He reached over and took her hand, the first time he'd done so without a reason attached to it, not to help her down from a wagon, not to seal an agreement, just to hold it. "Then let's go home, Mrs. Crow," he said. "We've still got a ranch to run, and I find I'd rather run it with you than without." Spring came to Briar Hollow the way it always did, late and grudging and then all at once, and by the time the first calves were dropping in the south pasture, nobody in town much remembered to whisper about how the Crow marriage had begun. They remembered instead the woman who'd stood up in court and told the truth plainly when it would have been easier to lie, and the rancher who'd ridden into town every Saturday for months just to stand beside his wife at the counter and let the whole county see exactly where he stood. Josephine still kept the ledgers. She still ran the house with the same careful competence she'd promised on the day they married. But some evenings now, when Bennett came in from the herds, he didn't go straight to his study with the day's accounts. He sat with her by the fire instead and told her about his day plainly, the way he told her most things, and she found she liked listening every bit as much as she'd once feared she never would. It hadn't been a love story at the start. It had been a debt, a deal, a pen dragging reluctantly across paper in a kitchen that smelled like fear. But somewhere between the silence and the small unspoken kindnesses, between a jar of liniment left without a note and a hand held for no reason at all, it had become one anyway, built not on a single grand gesture, but on 100 quiet ones. The kind that don't make for dramatic telling, but make for a life worth living. And if anyone in Briar Hollow asked Josephine Crow now whether she'd choose the same path again, knowing how it started, she'd tell them the truth, the same way she always did. She wouldn't change a single thing, not even the fear. Because the fear was what had taught her to recognize the kindness when it finally came.